Good afternoon. My name is Devadas, and I'm the CEO of the Future Moves Group. A few days ago, I invited my connections on LinkedIn to send in questions that they were hoping that I would be able to provide some answers and enlightenment to. And through this video, I'm going to answer three questions which I think are really important and pertinent to a general audience interested in what is happening today and what may happen over the next few years. Let me first start with the, I think, big picture question, which is how I see the pandemic of COVID-19 playing out and getting resolved. I think it's important to first start with a comparison to 2009, when we had the global financial crisis. During then, the leaders of major economies, central banks, and ministries of finance came together to coordinate action. The G8 became the G20. Central banks coordinated interest rate policies, monetary policies, and ministries of finance coordinated fiscal policy or stimuli. This helped to, first of all, to arrest the very steep declines in equity markets and in contractions of the real economy, but also helped to place a floor of confidence in the real economy and therefore lay the foundation for a recovery. What we are seeing today is very different. There is no global coordination, a very weak global coordination, and there's an absence of global leadership. In 2009, that global leadership was provided by the administration of President Barack Obama of the United States. Today, in contrast, what we see is the United States dispudiating international frameworks such as the UN and the WHO, the IMF and the World Bank. It has cut funding to the WHO, and it is involved in a blame game of pointing to China as the cause of the virus. Inside the US, there is no coherent policy to deal with COVID-19, and there's also a lack of direction in terms of how it intends to find its own way out of the crisis. This is important because in a global economic system, a global pandemic doesn't stay a public health issue. It very quickly becomes an economic and financial crisis as well. And this is what we are seeing today, with escalating job losses and business failures in a large number of advanced economies, not only in the United States and in Western Europe, but also in Asia and in Singapore. But there are different categories of economies. There are economies of final demand, there are economies of supply for that demand, and there are economies which are disintermediaries between the suppliers and the consumers of demand. Economies such as the United States, the European Union, Japan, and to some extent China are markets of final demand. China and India are suppliers of that demand, as are South Korea and a good part of ASEAN. Singapore is in a position of being a disintermediary between suppliers and consumers of final demand. And so we have a vested interest in how both the sources of final demand and the suppliers of final demand recover from COVID and catalyze economic action. We also have an interest in how well they work together to resolve these issues. In the absence of global leadership, what we've seen is regional leadership come to the fore, where the European Union leaders are working together, and within ASEAN, the ASEAN leaders are working together. And Singapore, through the leadership of Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, has tried to be a constructive and productive participant in how we collectively respond to COVID and recover as a region. A good example is the promotion of the idea of a COVID-19 contingency fund, which is intended to help some of the weaker ASEAN countries deal with the cost of managing COVID, and also in the sharing of information and data to help them with being able to address the public health challenges that they face in their countries, which may well be of a very different nature than from Singapore, which is very highly urbanized, whereas many of our ASEAN neighbors have large rural areas. This brings me to the observation that within the context of ASEAN, the 10 countries are vastly varied in terms of demography, in terms of geography, in terms of financial situation, in terms of political systems, and also in terms of stages of economic development and stability. And so, while there are challenges, I think there are also opportunities. The first opportunity is for ASEAN leaders to pursue to the full possible potential the ASEAN Economic Community concept. I think this is a time where we can act to lower tariffs, lower barriers, make more efficient the flow of capital and the flow of people across the ASEAN region. I think secondly, it's an opportunity for us to look at our contingency systems, such as the Chiang Mai Initiative and the new COVID-19 Contingency Fund, and see what more can be done to increase their size and add more flexibility to their use. Third, I think it's also an opportunity for ASEAN leaders to come together to recognize that it's possible for us to have a win-win solution even as we compete with each other. Because ultimately, as a region, we are bound by a common cultural heritage going back more than a millennia. We face many of the same geopolitical challenges, and we all want the same thing, which is peace and prosperity and stability. Let me now come to the second question that was posed to me, which is how I see a recovery taking shape. I think a recovery will be contingent on two fundamental developments. The first, the development of efficient and affordable testing kits that will allow for quick results within minutes rather than in hours or days. When this becomes available and at a low cost, all economies will be able to return to more routine operations while maintaining COVID precautions. The second is the discovery of a vaccine. Again, one that is effective, but also affordable and can be distributed globally. This is a global pandemic, not a localized one. And so it's important that both testing kits and vaccine be globally available and be distributed efficiently and rapidly. Some countries will need help financially in order to be able to secure adequate supplies of both testing kits and vaccines. And so it's important that the global community come together in our collective interest to ensure that we all, as a human species, benefit from what is required in terms of medical intervention to bring the pandemic to a close. There are some risks. While developing testing kits may be only months away, developing a vaccine may be 1 to 2 years away. In this time, COVID-19 could mutate, further protracting the development of a vaccine. It also could combine with other viruses, becoming a more complicated phenomena clinically to manage. The faster a vaccine can be developed and deployed, the lower the risk of that happening. And so it's vital that the global medical community coordinate, collaborate, share information and data, and that governments actively support and encourage this, rather than put in frictional breaks or think only at national level. I'm glad to say that Singapore is an example of a country that is doing both investments into developing testing kits, and trying to discover a vaccine, but actively sharing what it's learning with its neighbors and others around the world, including the WHO. Having established that we can find an effective and affordable and deployable testing and vaccine solution, what's important is how quickly economies can stabilize, especially economies of final demand. Because we are now seeing, especially in the United States, record levels of unemployment, and across the world, not least in Asia and in Singapore, rising cases of business failure and unemployment. So this is not only a public health problem, it is an economic one, and soon it will be a financial one. And it's important to recognize that while destruction of companies and jobs can happen quickly, creations of companies and jobs happens slowly. This asymmetry works against a scenario where we will have a rapid recovery. We are more likely to see a recovery which will be protracted and may have fits and starts. And also the definition of a recovery may well be very different from historical periods, where the expectation was a recovery to a 4 to 6% level of growth globally, especially here in ASEAN, to one where a 1 to 2% level of growth, annual growth, would be considered successful. This has consequences unevenly across countries. Singapore in particular, lacking natural resources and being highly urbanized and industrialized, with a very high income per capita level, will find it difficult to support the standards that its people have come to expect of public services with a 1 to 2% growth annually over a sustained period of time. Its solution in recent years has been to turn to a greater reliance on net return investment income. In other words, in leveraging on the investments from its sovereign wealth funds. Singaporeans have to realize that while this is a legitimate solution to rising public expenditures, and as a comparison, budgets at the beginning of this century, just 20 years ago, were about 50 billion a year. Today, they are close to 100 billion per year, even without stimulus measures. Will bring with it trade-offs, and these trade-offs will be intergenerational. And so we must be careful and calibrated, and we must be able to accept that the Goldilocks context in which we have existed for the last 30 years, where we've had a very high quality of public and merit goods provided at very low cost to the public, and low taxation, both corporate and individual, may no longer be sustainable. And that taxation levels may have to rise, both direct and indirect, in order to ensure that we do not over-rely on investment returns, and thereby cannibalizing the potential for us to earn reserves and accumulate them for future generations. I'm confident that the Singapore government's responses to date have been driven by a scientific and rational basis, and they're learning as they go. There have been mistakes, but their intentions are good, and their interventions are effective. Effectiveness has different ways of measuring. One of them is speed. The other is actual results. I think we should be focusing on results and not so much on speed. The foreign worker population is large, and dealing with the challenges of limiting the COVID infections within that community are not small. It will take time, but it is under control. Despite the fact that over 10,000 foreign workers have been infected, not a single one has been a fatality. I think that's something that we should all register as a measure of success, and we should recognize the efforts that have been made to achieve that success. Singaporeans should be prepared for a difficult economic journey over the next 12 to 24 months, and they should not underestimate how exposed and vulnerable they may be, regardless of educational level or industry, to the effects of economic contraction and slowdown. 2020 will be an especially hard year, and 2021 may be not much better. But we will get through. And we will get through because we have made investments in technology and infrastructure and in human capital decade after decade. We are not starting from a low base, and we are not starting with nothing. And I think as long as we have optimism and we have vision and we have cohesion, we will get through this and we will see better days. I look forward to further questions and challenging ones, and I will try to answer them in my next video. Thank you for your attention. Stay well and stay healthy.